Welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining us. My name is Piotr Sadowski, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you in my re-elected capacity as president of Social Platform. But I think it's also an even bigger honor for us to be joined by investigative journalist Matthew Caruana Galizia today. Matthew, as I am sure you all know, is one of the sons of Daphne Caruana Galizia, the Maltese journalistic powerhouse. And thank you very much for joining us. My name is Piotr Sadowski, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you in my re-elected capacity as president of Social Platform. But I think it's also an even bigger honor for us to be joined by investigative journalist Matthew Caruana Galizia today. Matthew, as I am sure you all know, is one of the sons of Daphne. We had a little bit of a technical issue there. Sorry about that, Matthew. I was saying that to all of our participants, Matthew is one of the sons of Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was a Maltese journalistic powerhouse, as I would describe her, who unearthed large-scale corruption in Malta, and in many cases leading back to the country's political elites. And Matthew, your mother's investigations were still making enormous shockwaves throughout Malta and the world when her life was cruelly and callously ended in 2017. So in honor of your mother and in the spirit of not giving up, not giving in, you and your family launched the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation, of which you are now the director. And Matthew, you now speak worldwide to keep your mother's memory and the values she in the end gave her life for very much alive. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with Social Platform today after our General Assembly. And I think it is an extremely important moment for Social Platform. As we continue to strengthen our advocacy on building a truly social Europe, we also engage with people like yourself, those who are fighting for the upholding of the rule of law across Europe. So welcome, Matthew. Could you share with us the context of the work of your late mother in exposing corruption in Malta and what the main issues are that she bravely exposed that you are now pushing forward?
Thank you for that introduction. Most people across Europe have only come to know of my mother and her work recently. But she was a journalist in Malta for 30 years. I mean, for most of my life, ever since I was a toddler. And I guess you could say that the nature of her work kind of grew or increased in scope with the stature of Malta within Europe. She was mostly focused on the lack of accountability, on corruption, yes, within high levels of government in Malta, lack of ethical standards or good governance standards for most of her career. But following EU membership, when Malta was suddenly flooded with easy money and financing, unfortunately, there was a missed opportunity pre-accession to reform Malta's institutions. So, of course, the levels of corruption within the country increased with the amount of money that was flooded in, and there were very few controls to kind of to put a stop to that corruption. So my mother was left alone for the last couple of years of her life. She was kind of the last thing standing between the people who are profiting of corruption and complete unlimited power. She was the kind of stone in their shoes, I suppose you could say that. And the last thing they needed to do before getting absolute control was to get rid of her, which they did in the end. There are many lessons that our country has to learn from that, but also lessons for Europe to learn. The foundation is focused on getting justice for my mother, justice for her investigations, and forcing both my country, Malta, and the European Union to learn lessons from what happened. Something has to be done to change institutions, to change laws, to change systems, to make sure we don't get to the point where a journalist is left fighting alone against the people who would ultimately murder her. And that when a murder like that does happen, her family don't have to spend years fighting to make sure that there is justice.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And I think my next question is really very much linked to what you just said, because of course, Malta is by no means alone in having problems with corruption, with limitations on freedom of the press, threats to the rule of law, and the associated consequences on democracy, fundamental rights, shrinking civil society space, and an impact on human beings, on people like yourself and your family, of course. We have concerns about conditions in Hungary and in my native Poland, among others. These seem to be in the news every day. I mean, in Poland, the Constitutional Court has just removed the mandate of the Polish ombudsman, Adam Bodnar, for daring to stand up for the rule of law in Poland, and including bringing several local council governments to court for their introduction of the LGBTI-free zones. And I mean, even in Denmark and France, laws are being introduced to clamp down on the freedom to protest. And Hungary is a case apart with its embrace of illiberal democracy. So what is your assessment of the state of play across the EU as a whole? And I need to ask this question because we're a social platform fighting for social and inclusive Europe where the rule of law is respected. Why are we seeing these trends at such an increasing and scary level across Europe?
I mean, first of all, Europe is not, I mean, European countries are not the first countries in the world to go through something like this. So there are many lessons to be learned from other countries that have lived through similar experiences. Before I moved back to Europe after my mother's murder, I spent a lot of time working in Central America. And a lot of the issues that I see now, or a lot of the attacks I see on democracy that I see now, are very similar to what I saw there. And this has kind of shaped my understanding of the problem in Europe, which, in my opinion, is that a lot of the rhetoric behind human rights abuses or attacks on democracy, democratic institutions, fundamental human rights, these are not arising from kind of differences in ideology. I mean, the debate between liberalism and illiberalism is almost a superficial one to me, because the underlying issue is, or the underlying matter for, say, the Hungarian government or the Polish government, is simply for the freedom to be corrupt, the freedom to enjoy impunity. And what do you have to do to enjoy the fruits of your corruption, to enjoy impunity? You have to abuse human rights. If a journalist is exposing your corruption, if an activist is attacking nepotism or a lack of accountability, then what do you do to have to stop them doing that? You need to basically violate their rights to make sure that you shut them up. So to me, these are the underlying reasons for the attacks on human rights. And when it comes to attacks on minority groups, this is simply a way of kind of holding up a group of people to society and using them to change the subject away from corruption. In creating, say, homosexual free zones and these kinds of ludicrous things that I never imagined seeing in Europe in my lifetime, what governments are doing is saying, look, we are not your enemy. These people are your enemy. Homosexual people are your enemy. Refugees are your enemy. And diverting the focus onto them. So what we see a lot of our work as being is making sure that the conversation remains focused on the real abuses, on the violations of human rights, on the corruption that is underlying them, and avoiding a shifting of the focus onto the people whom corrupt autocratic leaders want us to think are society's enemies.
Matthew, absolutely. I think it's extremely important what you're saying about this. It's not even a tendency now. It's a measure almost to use the ostracization and almost branding of groups of people as those who are potentially a threat to the fabric of our societies. Some member states like to refer to them as their national social models, and as you say, to deflect from the real abuses of power. But you yourself and the causes of journalistic freedom have had support in European institutions. The European Parliament has been active. We've seen the setting up of the Libe Committee's Rule of Law Monitoring Group in 2018. There was a fact-finding visit to Malta in 2019, the launch of the Daphne Caruana Galizia Prize for Journalism in 2020, and the adoption of resolutions in 2018, 2019, and even as recently as last month. And indeed, today, the European Parliament's Jury and Libe committees held a joint hearing that you, Matthew, we've seen you have tweeted about as well. And they have initiated a report on own initiatives on strengthening democracy and media freedom and pluralism in the EU, the undue use of legal actions to silence journalists, NGOs, and civil society, referred to as anti-SLAPP. And I can see that we have in the participants one of your MEPs, Roberta Metsola, as well, who has been nominated as one of the co-rapporteurs for the report. So in the context of all of this, but also the original resolution from 2018 that called for the setting of an EU mechanism to protect democracy, the rule of law, fundamental rights, I know that a lot of things have gone wrong, but what progress have you seen in the positive direction? But is it enough going forward?
I mean, look, corruption, money laundering, these are often seen as victimless crimes. You know, that if you do nothing about corruption, sure, it's a missed opportunity, but nothing overly negative is going to come of it. My mother's case and my family's case, I mean, that proves 1,000 times over that this is a massive misconception. And speaking as a victim of these so-called victimless crimes, I can say that now we feel much less alone than we did, say, 3 or 4 years ago, when we felt totally alone within Europe. I mean, sure, there was outrage within the European Parliament, but there was nothing coming from the Commission at the time to express, I mean, the kind of concern that you would expect to be expressed in a situation like that. The situation has changed completely over the past, especially over the past year. And when I sort of compare it to the position that we were in 3 years ago, I mean, it's like, it's like night and day, really, because it's a complete change in attitude from the Commission, and of course one that we welcome. I think the new Commission is kind of making up for lost time, but doing it well. The initiatives being taken by the Commission are good ones. The foundation that I run is a member of a coalition of NGOs that's pushing for legislation against strategic lawsuits against public participation, which are libel suits that are designed to shut up journalists and activists in a way that harasses them into shutting up. And we're really grateful and happy that we have the support of the Commission in our work, that we have the support of Vera Jourova. It means a lot to me. because my mother was a victim of these kinds of lawsuits, but it means a lot to all of the journalists around Europe who are victims of these same abuses of our laws.
Okay, so you said initially you felt very alone. Now a lot has changed. It's extremely positive. My other question would be, we cannot. I guess this is a lifelong advocacy battle that we cannot.
Yes,
we cannot
is.
stop. Right. So
it is.
What else? What is it enough? It's not enough. What else what else do we need? And how can we, as also civil society, work with activists and people who want to see social justice served? How can we work together to ensure that rule of law, freedom of speech, but also freedom of being a human being is respected across Europe?
I mean, that freedom to be a human being, it just says it all, because the thing is, the economics of it are completely skewed. I mean, lobbyists, lawyers for corrupt officials, and I mean, organized criminals are paid millions, hundreds of millions for their work to represent these people, whereas activists in comparison are paid such a small amount of money, and on top of that are made to suffer enormously just for doing their work. So the thing is that most people just want to go about living their lives and working in kind of regular jobs. They don't want to give up a large part of their lives to have to fight organized crime, to have to fight corrupt officials. I mean, sure, when there's a need for it, most people are willing to go out and protest, but we cannot expect all of society to be 100% vigilant all of the time and continuously involved in activism. It's just completely unrealistic. Although it seems that this is what is needed at this time. So something has to be done, and something really radical to change the systems, to make sure that they're skewed in the favor of the public interest rather than in favor of obscurity or of private interest or of secrecy, lack of accountability. I mean, organized criminal groups, at the moment, they're skewed in that direction, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. I do have some further questions that I would like to put forward to you. However, I would also like to engage with our participants. We have attendees in our webinar. We're also streaming on YouTube, so my colleagues in the team are also picking up questions through that channel. I do have a question from Mary Collins from European Women's Lobby. If I could ask that Mary is actually able to join us and ask the question directly, that would be great. Mary, if you unmute now, I think you can actually also switch your camera on and ask the question directly to Matthew.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you so much, Matthew, for keeping your mother's memory alive. And I have no doubt she would have been so proud of you.
Thank you.
She was a woman, and I'm working with the European Women's Lobby. And we know that women are singled out, targeted, made vulnerable, and also made silenced because there is this impunity around violence. And unfortunately, in this case, it led to the death of your mother. And you probably know, I don't know if you do know, but there is this so-called Istanbul Convention, which actually today is celebrating its 10th anniversary. So it's a convention of the Council of Europe, which aims to eradicate through government policies, etc., on violence against women. So I just wanted to bring this in because there's obviously a huge backlash today about the Istanbul Convention itself, and about silencing, and about retracting from all those commitments that were made. So I really would like to ask you, because it is a kind of a global issue, we can't dissociate different issues. And this Istanbul Convention is absolutely vital as well to ensure that all women, no matter where they live in Europe, are actually protected, and there's no impunity around violence against women, and obviously, leading to this dramatic situation which you're living in. So I would like to ask you, first of all, about the Istanbul Convention, if you think that that too can be a tool in terms of adding to the fact of ensuring that there's freedom of speech and that human rights are being granted. But also to ask you then what you think we can do as civil society globally, from the women's movement, from the feminist movement, and civil society globally, what we can do to help you in terms of seeking justice, absolute justice, in terms of what you have gone through, which is extremely painful and which is extremely, terrible. And we'd just like to ask you what you think, what would you like to ask us to do, knowing that there are other avenues as well, in terms of ensuring that the freedom of speech of everybody, and particularly women, are guaranteed. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that question. I mean, it's a really good one. To me, I mean, there's a bit of confusion between kind of people who take the word violence as to mean literal violence, and the story of what my mother endured leading up to that literal act of violence that was her murder. Now, while she was, yes, my mom was a woman and she was murdered, but the majority of the gendered attacks on her were in the lead up to her murder, and perhaps not the murder itself. So my family, especially through the process of the public inquiry that looks into whether my mother's murder was preventable, we've been pointing out that what the government of Malta did leading up to the murder was create an atmosphere not just of impunity for corruption and attacks on verbal attacks on journalists, but also of dehumanization. So my mother was one of the nicknames for my mother used most frequently by all kinds of people, but including especially governing party officials, and they would use it on the TV station that they own and the radio station and then their newspapers and so on, was that my mother was a witch, which is kind of a medieval slur, but it was used really often. And in kind of cartoons in the propaganda newspapers owned by the governing party, she would be depicted as a witch. In a kind of skit on the governing party's propaganda TV station, again, she would be depicted as a witch with a kind of prosthetic nose and always holding a bottle of Jack Daniels. And it was just horrific. So I think the kind of global recognition of violence against women has to extend towards at least a positive obligation on the government, on a state, to ensure that women are humanized and not dehumanized. Because I think that in the case of my mother, the Maltese government, the state of Malta, not only failed to protect my mother and other women journalists and activists like her from gendered attacks, but it was also a perpetrator of these attacks. And of course, this is not something that we expect to see in the European Union, especially with the EU as a promoter of the Istanbul Convention. So to me, the responsibility on states has to extend towards an obligation to ensure that women are humanized and not dehumanized. And the definition of violence has to include dehumanization as an act of violence.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you, Mary, for posing that question. Matthew, if you agree, we'll take a couple more questions before going further into our conversation. There is a question first from Una Aitken. Welcome, Una. If you unmute and put on your camera, you've got the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a really heartrending story that you tell, and one that makes me personally feel very, very emotional. I think we're seeing in Europe a kind of very worrying populist turn, not just now in the countries of Eastern Europe, but all over the European Union. And I wonder, how we can call politicians to account for this kind of this turn that we're seeing. I was actually going to ask the question Mary asked about what civil society organisations like the ones that are represented here today can do to help the cause that you're putting forward so strongly. But I wonder if there's anything, if you've any comment on that populist turn that you mentioned earlier on, and how we can call politicians to account for that, and how we can get them to respond to it in a much more positive and perhaps a stronger way than we see politicians responding at the moment. But I also just wanted to say thank you so much for your testimonial today and for joining us at the social platform. Thank you.
It's a bit difficult for me to answer this question because out of all the people on this call, I think I'm the one with the least experience in this kind of activism, because I was kind of thrown into this following my mother's murder. And of course, it's something I embrace, but I mean, I have to acknowledge that I'm not as experienced as everyone else in fighting for accountability. But speaking from that limited experience, what I can say is that what we've learned to do is use every single tool that there is available. A lot of our work early on, I mean, even before the foundation was set up, was working out what tools there are nationally, internationally, that we can use, even tools that have never been used before in a case like ours, and set about using them to drive accountability. This might mean turning to institutions that have never been used in the European Union before. For example, one of the first things we did after the murder was turn to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe for the election of a special rapporteur to investigate the full circumstances of the assassination. And this ended up being an extremely powerful tool. It had only been used twice before in the entire history of the Council of Europe, and both times for murders that took place in Russia. The murder of Anna Politkovskaya and the murder of Boris Nemtsov. It had never been used for an EU member state before. But we recognized that this tool was available and ran with it. And this kind of taught us a very important lesson early on, to use lesser known tools that might perhaps surprise the person that you're working to hold to account. I mean, of course, I have to acknowledge that, I mean, we seem to have increasingly fewer and fewer tools at our disposal. So this is becoming, in turn, increasingly difficult.
Thank you, Matthew. We actually do have a colleague from the Council of Europe who's recently been elected as the president of the Conference of INGOs. Gerhard Ermischer. So before I go to another question from Furkan, Gerhard, could you come back on the specific tools that are at hand and how the institutions can also offer help to such vitally important causes that Matthew and his family are fighting for? Gerhard, you will be put to the panel to give some comments, but perhaps also ask some questions.
Yeah, hello. I think my camera takes some time to kick in, but I hope you can hear me already. Yeah, okay. So thank you very much. Yes, I mean, Matthew already has said the most powerful one, going to the Parliamentary Assembly and asking for a special rapporteur. And that, of course, is one of the most powerful instruments the Council of Europe has, besides, of course, the Court of Human Rights and its mechanisms. Of course, the Council of Europe is not like the EU, so it has no direct instruments of pressure. It cannot put sanctions on countries. But these tools aim to publicity and in a way to shame the states and the governments who perpetrate such things. And then, of course, we as the Conference of NGOs with our members, we can help in such cases, maybe less as the conference itself, but with the members we have, because we have really, really strong human rights and civil rights defenders organizations in our membership who know how to campaign, who know how to raise awareness and to make a lot of noise. But I would also like, if you give me the floor now, I would like to thank Matthew specifically for what he said very early on, when he said that corruption is often seen as a victimless crime. And very, very powerfully then has showed that this is not the case. And in the last period, we had a working group looking into corruption in Europe in different states. Malta was, of course, one of the cases. Azerbaijan, which is linked up to Malta, Romania, Bulgaria, and others, where we're looking into it. And what we saw in all of them is that the first victim of true corruption coming down from the top level, from the government, is the whole society. It's democracy. Because when you have that kind of corruption in which you then build an atmosphere where you let trickle down some of the benefits to people on the ground who hold up their hands gratefully to get a little bit from the top and become dependent by that on those who give them these benefits, it undermines the whole society. And it creates this atmosphere which you have described, in which people are willing to see those who fight against corruption as enemies. And the dehumanization, which has been described, we saw that, for example, in our country visit in Serbia, the same structures about journalists who try to speak up against corruption and misuse of power in the government, and the same kind of dehumanization of making them, declaring them not just traitors, but, for example, sexual perverts, criminals, people who would themselves take bribes and with completely unfunded allegations, slandering them in the eyes of people, so to destroy their credibility and to destroy their humanity, and so make them, if not shut up, at least make people not listen to them, because everybody then knows that these people are unreliable and they are not good people and they are the enemies of the people. And I think that is really the core of this whole corruption business, that is destroys the whole society. And I'm, of course, extremely grateful for you to fight this fight with the background of the tragedy of your mother, which has been killed in trying to bring those to account who perpetrate these crimes. So thank you very much to you. And yes, the Council of Europe and also the Conference of NGOs can be helpful, at least in a moral way, if not in a truly legal way or power way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerhard. Matthew, would you like to come back on that with any comments before we give the floor to one more question?
Yes, one of the things that I forgot to mention in response to the previous question is that another positive thing that the Commission has done is to increase independently administered financial support to investigative journalism, which is extremely important because most of these journalistic investigations into corruption were mostly done in a kind of unfunded, in your spare time way. But the funding from the Commission has resulted in making these kinds of investigations more commonplace. But of course, that has to be coupled with executive and judicial powers to react to the corruption that is exposed by investigative journalism. But obviously, overall, the support for investigative journalists that's now coming from the Commission is really positive.
And if I can ask you, can you also see that the Commission really has become more proactive on the money laundering and on the corruption side of the whole thing? Because in our investigations just 2 years ago, it was more like all the money laundering problems we saw from Malta, they were reported through the American banks and the American Federal Bank, and then the Commission at some point was forced to react to that because American judiciary was asking them for support. But it didn't really come from the European side in the beginning.
I think that there is a recognition between the services of the European Union that more has to be done about money laundering at a supranational level within European institutions. But from what I see, those institutions consistently do not get the budget increases that they need to be able to properly act on money laundering. If you look at the budgets that are available to US authorities, including the Treasury Department, FinCEN, OFAC, and so on, they have massive budgets that outstrip the budgets of European institutions many times over. The European Banking Authority, which is, from what I last read, fighting for a budget increase as well as an increase in staff numbers that will allow it to take more responsibility for investigating money laundering across the European Union within banks, has not received the budget increases that it needs or the staff increases that it needs. Again, the European Public Prosecutor's Office, it needs a budget increase, it needs more staff, it needs a wider mandate to cover crimes of corruption. I know that there's a consultation process ongoing to kind of reform Europol to give it new responsibilities and make it more effective. But it comes down to budget increases and staff increases. And what often blocks these, the Council of Ministers. There's a kind of unwillingness from the heads of member states to allocate the funds that are required to make the EU more effective.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you, Gerhard. I will move over to and request that we give the floor to Furkan Sorkunçuk, I believe, joining us from Turkey.
So, hi everyone. Thank you, Mati, for being with us today. And we talked about the Istanbul Convention, and it is actually, I am based in Istanbul right now. So my question will be about the student protests in Turkey, and it's about the link between the civil society movements and maybe the youth generation. So as you may know, in January 2021, we had a decision from the Erdogan, and it's about assigning a rector to the Boğaziçi University, which is the most maybe the most prestigious university in Turkey. And day by day, the movement, the student movement, before that, some of the students were detained or arrested due to their participation to the protest. So after the day by day, the movement lost its power, I think, and this is because the day by day, the people starts to not think about the protest, or they start to just live their life. So I think this is the problem for the movements in 21st century. And on the other side, I think this will be the good part. After 1 month or 2 months after or 3 months after, the different movements, the LGBTI movement or the woman empowerment or the general human rights movements are gathered together to fight against the dictatorship in Turkey or in Istanbul. So this is the good part from us. So my general question is about the youth generation. Like, we are the youth generation and we are fighting against the whole thing, I think, the climate justice or basically the academic freedom. So what do you think about our side? Like, we as youth generation, what can we do, or what is our role in fighting against this type of corruption, this type of dictatorship, or this type of, I don't know, like the breach of the human rights?
I mean, the first step is always to document and expose abuses of power, corruption, human rights abuses. And when I look at what's happening in Turkey and Hungary, the steps that are taken by the governments there are to destroy precisely this, to destroy independent media and remove the ability to document and expose abuses of power and corruption. So when we're faced with this situation, we have to do everything possible to find other ways to document and expose those abuses, whether it's reporting from outside the country, which is again extremely difficult, or setting up new media organizations, finding funding elsewhere. Of course, as we become more effective at doing this, then the state will continue to find new ways to overpower us. It's always a game of who can last the longest, and a very dangerous one. But I simply don't know what else to say. I mean, there's no Batman who's going to come and save us. I mean, we just have to kind of do it ourselves.
Thank you, Matthew. And I think that the tone of the questions, but also from all our participants, is that we're in this together as well.
Yes, exactly. So that's really important to say.
Precisely. And we really need to stand united and be supportive of one another. And especially after a very challenging, difficult year, because of the pandemic, which has had an enormous impact, not just on the health and social situation across Europe, across the world, but it also, of course, exacerbated so many of the threats to our day-to-day freedoms. So freedom of movement and freedom of assembly, state involvement in our daily behavior, privacy and data protection. And as we all know, some governments hid behind the pandemic and used the COVID-19 emergency powers granted to them as an excuse to propose and approve legislation that jeopardizes freedom of expression and human rights. So on the one hand, I heard you said last year created a lot of positive movement and moving forward, but also we've had those restrictions brought on us. And of course, for a reason to have this balance between protecting public health, but also at the same time, it encroached on civil liberties. So how can we ensure that the right information is reaching people so that they know how to stay safe, and especially as we hopefully come out of the pandemic, but they also know how to defend their rights, because in a year's time, we've almost forgot about how to defend our rights. So how do we relearn that, but also how do we ensure that those shrunk liberties because of the pandemic are restored?
I mean, what the pandemic has done is, I mean, I think one of the worst aspects of it in the context of the fight for human rights and against corruption is that it has increased the economic pressure on people who do this kind of work, which just adds another layer of difficulty. And of course, our mission during this time, I mean, even for the foundation, is the Daphne Caruana Galizia Foundation is to just make sure that we come out of it alive, and that we kind of live to fight another day. That's really our mission during the pandemic. Something that I forgot to add to the previous answer is that the importance of documentation and the importance of exposing acts of corruption, even if it might seem pointless, especially kind of in the current circumstances, is that, I mean, even though he might think he is, Erdogan is not immortal, Putin is not immortal, Orban is not immortal. They are not going to remain in power forever. There is going to come a time when justice will be possible. And when that time comes, what the justice process is going to have to rely on information that was collected in the present, documentation that was produced in the present, sorry. If no one is around to expose that corruption, to document it, to document human rights abuses, then even when the window of opportunity for justice arises, there isn't going to be any, simply because no one has documented the evidence. And of course, this is why the work of journalists and activists in documenting these abuses is so important and so crucial, and that has to be done whatever the circumstances.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I had one further question from myself around the engagement of civil society with human rights and social justice activism and activists such as yourself. But I think that question is now slightly obsolete, because it's as I said, it's extremely visible and clear that we are behind you, and we are there as well to support you. And we've had input from the institutions as well. However, I do believe that there's a few further questions before we've got about 10-12 minutes before we have to finish. There is a question from Alva Finn, who is actually the incoming director of Social Platform. And then we've got the question from MEP Roberta Metsola. So I'll go first to Alva, and then Roberta, I'll move to you.
Can you hear and see me?
I can hear you.
Strange, I have my camera on. Let me try again. No?
It's fine.
Aha, there we go.
Okay, we see you now.
Good. Yeah, I'm Alva Finn. I'm the incoming director of Social Platform. And yeah, thanks so much for giving us your perspective and not only keeping your mother's memory alive, but also her life's work alive. And I think it's such a powerful example of holding the EU to account for their role, not just in accountability around your mother's death, but also for rule of law and the misuse of EU funds, which I think this story really shows us can be destabilizing. And I think that for a long time, the EU didn't want to look at that. And I think that, you know, your work around the rule of law and corruption will live long in the memory, I think, of the institutions, that they can't just ignore it any longer. But I do want to have your perspective on more recent attempts to control the rule of law around the use of stopping funds, because that issue has really been politicized now. And I think that it can be dangerous to politicize the rule of law. And I do wonder how these conversations play out at national level. So I'd love to hear what you think about that. You know, what is the media which, I mean, you've already told us about some of the terrible things and the way that they treated your mother. What are they saying about this politicization of the use of EU funds and the rule of law? Because I think that's something that is a bit obscured for us who are working at Brussels level.
I mean, to me, the mechanism or the idea that the supply of funds should be tied to respect for the rule of law is a basic one. I mean, it's just basic morality when you think about it. And of course it should be there, but it is there as a kind of last resort, or let's say kind of as a sword of Damocles. What is more important as a tool than that? Because ideally we would have more tools that target individuals rather than entire countries. And I think that that is where the European Public Prosecutor's Office is more effective, because its mandate is specifically this, to investigate fraud in the use of EU funds. And prosecutions will be of individuals who are directly involved in that fraud, in that organized crime, or what is called racketeering in the US, rather than targeting entire countries. And that is, of course, more powerful. Also, the system, the way the EPPO is designed, it's a kind of peer-to-peer system where authorities in the member states are involved in the decision to prosecute and are involved in the prosecution, but they can't just opt out of it. I mean, they can't just opt out of the decision to prosecute. So this is a more important tool, and it's really crucial that every single member state signs up to the EPPO.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you, Alva. We're shortly be running out of time. However, I would like to give the floor now to Roberta Metsola, who's a member of the European Parliament, hailing from Malta as well. Roberta, we will give you the floor now, and welcome.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
I'm trying to turn on. Yes. Hi. So I know that you're running out of time, and I really wanted to thank you, Piotr. I want to thank you, Matthew, for answering all these questions and giving me and my colleagues so many things to work on in the next few weeks and months. Today, as you also said, we launched the sort of first cross-party proper debate on what we want to see in this Parliament with regards to SLAP, to strategic lawsuit against public participation. I think the message that came across both with the journalists who interviewed us today, but also with colleagues from all the political groups, is that the aim of such lawsuits against both journalists, activists, civil society organizations is not to win a case, but it's to silence, it's to intimidate, it's to prevent the truth from coming out. And speaking for us, I think what we also need to make clear is that we are determined to look at all the possibilities, both legal and political tools, and also that we are determined to make sure that what happened in Malta with regards to Daphne and also this ongoing atmosphere of intimidation and harassment does not happen again anywhere else. I think that is our role in order to make sure that we come up with a tool that can precisely help to prevent that from ever happening again.
Thank you very much, Roberta. And Matthew, I'll give the final comments to you, and then I'll close as well with just a few reflections myself.
Okay, just to say that, to close with what you said about about working together. Justice in my mother's case is not being achieved by one person alone, or by my family alone, or by one organization alone. It really took a big group of people from across many different companies and organizations and institutions and governments, working together, perhaps even without knowing, but working towards the same aim, to achieve what we have achieved so far. And it will continue to take the same way of working together to achieve full justice. The lesson from that, not just for other murders of journalists, but for cases of extreme corruption and abuses of human rights that are taking place across Europe, it remains the same. That we have to work together, not driven, I think, by any sense of political ideology. As someone said in a press conference that I was listening in on previously, that the rule of law has no political color. But by an understanding that that corruption and abuses of human rights should eventually become things of the past.
Thank you, Matthew. And Roberta, any final remarks from you as well?
Yeah, precisely on what Matthew just said, that when we're talking about the rule of law and the rules that matter for a country to enter the European Union, should continue to apply as long as that country is bound by the laws and the values and the principles. And what we have seen is a backsliding of these principles of countries who simply take EU membership for granted, and where we are asked, what are you as political representatives going to do to help us regain the trust in the authorities, in the institutions? Where are the funds going? You spoke about also the Public Prosecutor's Office earlier, but more importantly now, going forward, where will all those millions that we voted on with regards to the COVID recovery funds, the recovery and resilience, but also the multi-annual financial framework, are we going to make sure that the money goes to who is really wanting to work for the well-being of society, to the betterment of our society? And that's where we all have to work together to make sure that national action plans are vetted, and every check is done in order to make sure that the money does not end up in the wrong people's pockets. That has happened all too often, and we would then need every institution of the European Union to make sure that it really pulls its weight in ensuring that this doesn't happen, because ultimately we are going to be paying back these millions for decades after what we voted on last year. So we have a responsibility to make sure that the parameters are strong and correct. And one of the programs that has just been adopted in the strategy is the rights and values programs. And that's where I see a lot of work that could be used to help small media houses, investigative journalists, in other organizations that are working on a smaller scale, precisely to make sure that those rights and values are upheld. So thank you very much, and I look forward to meeting with all of you again in the process of us drawing up the report with me and Timo Volkan, my colleague from the S&D Group.
Indeed, Roberta, thank you very much. And I assure you that we as Social Platform stay committed to working with you as well, the applicability of the rule of law. As Matthew said, it's the question of basic morality. It has to be applied. And as you said also, Matthew, whatever the political color, there are progressive political movements. I'm not talking about certain non-progressive political movements, but within those groups, we need to work together. And we also wholeheartedly support you, Matthew, and your family in your ongoing work to ensure that full justice is served for your mum's assassination. I am extremely grateful to you on behalf of Social Platform and all of our panelists for the fact that you came with us together today and have spoken so frankly and openly about something that I just cannot imagine how difficult it must have been. time, there's the saying, time heals, and I know it sometimes it ups and downs, but rest assured, we are here to support you. We want to also work with the institutions to support your work and the work of investigative journalism. You'd mentioned Vera Jourova, a very important person as well. I'm really glad that you have Vera Jourova's support as well in your work. And finally, whilst I said I will do the closing, I think actually it's much more appropriate to ask you for some of your final comments, Matthew. And just as I say, thank you very much.
Thank you, Piotr, and also to Roberta Metsola for her remarks and for her support for the anti-SLAPP campaign. Without the leadership of MEPs, it wouldn't have come this far. Definitely, it goes back to what I said about economic interests being skewed in favor of those who commit acts of corruption and those who defend them. What we're trying to do is kind of readjust that balance so that it's a bit more in the favor of people who fight against corruption and human rights abuses.
Thank you very much, Matthew. So on that note, I'd like to thank you to everyone who was part of our conversation, and thank you, Matthew. We will be in touch afterwards. For now, I wish you and your family absolutely all the best. Keep safe, keep well, and continue fighting for justice, for social rights, for advocacy, for freedom of press, and for protection of the human dignity that we all should have the right to enjoy in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.